This is Chris Meyer from Washington, D.C. in the Environmental Defense Fund, and I have the pleasure of moderating this webinar today to discuss the paper and research around forest carbon assessment in the Amazon's indigenous and protected areas. We have here today with us an excellent panel, and I will present first the introductions of Dr. Wayne Walker and Dr. Tina Oliveira. Dr. Walker is the assistant scientist at Woods Hole Research Center. His focus of his work is applications of remote sensing to forest monitoring with an emphasis on the tropics. Dr. Oliveira is the Director of Research and Development at Provida, a nonprofit in Venezuela, and her focus is on tropical forest ecology. Dr. Walker will begin the presentation and we'll pass to Dr. Oliveira and follow it up with some comments from Steve Schwarzman afterwards and then we'll open up the broader to questions, hopefully leaving about 35 minutes. Okay? Dr. Walker?
Thank you, Chris, for that introduction. Thank you, everybody, for joining this webinar this morning, and thank you to the World Bank for hosting. My colleagues and I this morning are going to be talking about our recently published efforts to quantify, really for the first time, the amount of carbon contained in the indigenous territories and the protected natural areas of the 9 countries spanning the Amazon, and also assessing the extent to which these indigenous territories and protected natural areas are at risk from current pressures and near-term threats associated with development activities spanning the range of primary production and infrastructure sectors, including petroleum, agriculture, transportation, and so forth. But before I get into the details of what we did, how we did it, and our findings, I'd like to spend just a few moments talking about the development of this project, how we got to this point. And it's really some 5 years in the making. It was really a question that was some 5 years in the asking. And it began in 2009 with a series of 9 capacity building workshops held one each in each of the 9 Amazon Basin countries. They were conducted under the auspices of the NORAD-funded Forum on Readiness for RED, which was a collaboration of a number of organizations, including the Woods Hole Research Center, the Environmental Defense Fund, EPAM in Brazil, and others, as well as done in support of what was at the time the Woods Hole Research Center's effort to generate for the first time a consistent pan-tropical map of above-ground carbon stock at an unprecedented resolution of 500 meters. Now, these capacity building workshops were unique in that they were requested by COICA, and COICA, as many of you may know, is the coordinator of indigenous organizations of the Amazon Basin, an umbrella organization, and they requested these workshops so as they might build capacity among their membership in not only the policy side of RED readiness, but also the technical side, including the measurement and mapping of above ground carbon stocks. And so it so happens that in light of these ongoing activities, the capacity building workshops, the mapping activities, at COP15 in Copenhagen, we were approached by some of our indigenous colleagues who were wondering if we could use this mapping effort to quantify the amount of carbon contained in their indigenous territories. And initially we thought to ourselves, well, this will be very straightforward. It's a straightforward enough question. And of course we knew to some extent that the answer would be that there's of course a lot of carbon contained in these indigenous territories. We knew that there was a lot of carbon contained in the Amazon. But our indigenous colleagues were very interested in arming themselves with hard data, with information that could be brought to bear by themselves, that they could take ownership of, the information and that they could use in the context of their own decision-making activities and their own negotiating, both at national and international levels. So we began to think more seriously about undertaking this analysis for Amazonia. But if we take a look at Amazonia by the numbers, we find that this is a very large, expansive, and diverse area. And I'd like to point out, before we go any further, that our definition of Amazonia here is the definition established by the Amazonian Network of Georeferenced Socio-Environmental Information, who I'll refer to henceforth by their acronym RICE. And they established the boundary that you see here, limited by in the color pink. And it's important to understand that this particular boundary of Amazonia is neither, strictly speaking, the legal Amazon nor the hydrologic Amazon. It's a combination of political and biophysical factors that have gone into defining this particular region as we see it here. And so if we look at Amazonia by the numbers, we see, of course, as we've said, there are 9 countries, so it's very diverse in that sense politically. It's a huge area, some 7.8 million square kilometers, and that includes some 2,344 individual indigenous territories, as well as some 610 protected natural areas, again, spanning the 9 countries and this large geographic space. And finally, where carbon storage is concerned, we're talking about some 86 billion metric tons. And just for perspective, that's 38% of the carbon stored above ground across the tropics. So we're talking about a huge, politically, culturally, biophysically diverse area and a tremendous amount of carbon. So when we started to think more seriously about it, the question and therefore the analysis became more complicated. Of course, we were working on a large pantropical mapping project, and we knew that one of the things we would need to answer this question is necessarily a consistent source, an accurate source of above-ground carbon stocks. But almost more importantly, we would need detailed information on the spatial extent of the indigenous territories and protected natural areas themselves. And fortunately, the RICE network and their member organizations across the 9 countries was involved then and continues to be involved now in maintaining a very detailed and up-to-date database of the spatial extent of these indigenous territories and protected natural areas. It's the best database by far that is out there. And so we entered into a collaboration with them to make use of these data, combining our map from the Woods Hole Research Center of above-ground carbon density, which was published by my colleague Alessandro Baccini in 2012 in Nature Climate Change, together with the Indigenous Territories and Protected Natural Areas, which is published by RICE also in 2012. So we had a sort of fortunate confluence of events here in 2012, wherein for the first time we had these 2 large, consistent, and accurate databases being produced for the first time that could be brought to bear together on this problem. And so we conducted a GIS-based analysis using these primary data inputs. And I'll just review here quickly some of our key findings. First of all, what you see in the figure that's showing on the screen is effectively a pie chart for the region, divided into indigenous territories in orange, protected natural areas in green, the overlap region between the two in cross-hatching, and then all other lands shown in gray. And what you can see is that a tremendous amount of carbon, this is carbon stock that we're looking at in this pie chart. What you can see is that a tremendous amount of carbon is contained within these protected natural areas and indigenous territories. As I mentioned earlier, within the entire limit of Amazonia as defined by the pink boundary, roughly 38% of the carbon stored above ground across tropical America, Africa, and Asia is contained here. And we found that within the 9-nation network of nearly 3,000 indigenous territories and protected natural areas, which happens to span more than 52% of this region by area, this network stores 55% of the basin's carbon, or of the region's carbon, or over 20% of the pantropical total. And really, this was one of the most interesting and compelling findings, because whereas we knew that the Amazon basin stored a lot of carbon, we did not know just how much, of course, was contained within this network. And just to put that in perspective, that's more carbon, this 55% is more carbon than is stored in Indonesia and the DRC combined. And these are two very important countries, a lot of investment, a lot of discussion focused on their carbon stocks. But here in the Amazon, in these ostensibly protected lands alone, we have more carbon. And I say ostensibly protected because in a moment Tina is going to be talking more specifically about the pressures and threats facing these areas. If we look at the indigenous territories alone, we see that nearly a third of the carbon is stored within those regions. That's more than either Indonesia or the DRC stores. So a tremendous amount of carbon just in indigenous territories. We can break this distribution of carbon down, of course, by country. What you have here on the y-axis is carbon in millions of metric tons. You can see, obviously, that the distribution by country varies a great deal, largely because of the difference in area associated with the various countries. Naturally, Brazil dwarfs all other countries. But if we zoom in on this portion of the graph so that we can get a better resolved sense of those other 8, you can see again that the distribution varies a great deal. For example, in Colombia, 80% of the carbon is stored within indigenous territories, whereas in Peru, it's about 55. So there's a tremendous diversity there in terms of what you see across the countries. It's also important to understand that across the countries, but also within each country, what defines an indigenous territory or a protected natural area is very different. That is, they're not all created equal. And for example, some 14% of the indigenous territories that are indicated here in orange don't actually fall under the category of having official recognition. So in some sense, they're only recognized on paper and really have no solid protection at all. Here, if we take another look at the same information, now looking at the percentage of carbon by country within the Amazon as a total, with each bar representing now 100%, you can also see quite a lot of variability in the distribution. For example, roughly 5 of the 9 countries have 50% of their carbon or less within some form of protected status. The other 4, being Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela, have more than 50% protected, and Brazil is really sort of right on the border. So a great deal of variability in terms of the level of protection. But what's of course important is the extent to which this protection really matters. And at this point I'm going to turn the floor over to Tina, who's going to talk more about our pressures and threats analysis associated with these carbon stocks.
Hi, morning or good afternoon, everybody. Well, inside RISE, we work with pressures and threats. Pressures are areas directly impacted by current development projects. That means when we analyze the different activities in the Amazon area, we analyze if they are currently happening or if they are projected. In that case, the projected...
Sorry.
Yeah?
Do you mind to connect your camera?
I'm sorry. I did, but I forgot to start sharing.
Thanks.
Sorry. Okay. So we distinguish, how I said before, between pressures, that means areas directly impacted, from threats, that means areas where some development is projected in the near future. In our case, we analyze the effect of deforestation, and deforestation includes agriculture, grazing, and timber. Also, we analyze the mining effect, the petroleum effect, and transportation. And we analyze that pressures and threats over the indigenous territories, protected natural areas, and of course in the overlapping between these areas and outside of these areas. So how you can see here, the areas there are pressures and or threats, depends, are the more or less pink ones. Most of them are located in the external, more the external areas of the Amazon region. In general, 52%, as Wayne said before, of the Amazon is contained within a network of almost 3,000 indigenous territories and protected areas, natural areas. However, more than 50% of that area, the Amazon area, is in risk because there are a lot of mining projects, a lot of pressures with agriculture activities, and so on. So even when that area is inside of indigenous territories or protected natural areas, they are not really safe. And 46% of that area is in risk. And 43% of this at-risk carbon is contained within the borders of the Amazon, ITs, and PNAs. And 8% inside these areas are also at risk. 13% of the sea stored above ground in Amazonian ITs is contained within territories lacking official recognition. That is the case, for example, of Venezuela, where we have something like 2 or 3 areas with official recognitions. So it's a huge problem. Well, this is the map. This is one of the products of our analysis. And I would like to see with more detail. You can see here several colors. And I would like to see in the legend, the brown areas are the areas with less carbon, and green one, the areas with the highest value of carbon. So you can see a huge diversity inside the Amazon area in terms of the content, the storage carbon. Here, if you see the indigenous territories, we analyze 2 types: indigenous territories recognized and indigenous territories not recognized. And in the case of natural areas, we have 4 kinds of natural protected areas. There are indirect use with direct use and some mixed use or transitory areas. That is the reason that we have different kind of risk in different areas inside the Amazon region. For example, in this case, it's the case of Xingu, very famous in Brazil. This area, okay, is inside, is a indigenous territory recognized. But if you can see inside of the Xingu, you have different ecosystems with different carbon, different density of carbon, right? For example, in this area, the density is higher than in this area, okay? And outside, you have also different levels of carbon density. In this case, we are between Peru, Colombia, and Brazil. This is the Iquitos, and this is the Rio Solimões. Rio Negro. And here you can see the same. Some areas have a high density of carbon, and in this case, the problem where is, well, we have a lot of areas in natural protected areas with direct use. What is the meaning of that? You can do a lot of activities inside of these regions, and how you can see these areas are in the same place where you can find the higher levels of carbon density. The other product where you can find more details about the results that we obtain is in this paper, The Forest Carbon in Amazonia, and it is published in the Carbon Management Journal, and it's an open source paper. So I let you with Steve.
So thanks, Tina. I'm Steve Schwarzman. I'm Director of Tropical Forest Policy at the Environmental Defense Fund. Thanks, everybody, for turning out. So I'm just going to talk really briefly here before we get into a discussion about kind of the history and
Sorry.
how we got...
Avi, do you mind connecting your camera?
Oh, sorry.
Thanks.
Better? Yeah. I'm going to give kind of a prequel to this story. We've seen, based on the analysis that Rice and Woods Hole Research Center have carried out, that the carbon stocks of the indigenous territories and protected areas of the Amazon are really sufficiently great to be directly relevant to the global atmosphere. What happens to those carbon stocks will have an effect on global climate one way or another, and in fact already affect global climate in terms of rainfall patterns and in other ways. But I just want to kind of take a brief look at how we got to this situation of us over half of the Amazon basin being indigenous territories and protected areas. I look at this from the perspective of my friend Screntoma Panara, who you see here. Screntoma's a Panara Indian. He was born in the early 1950s, lived and grew up in one of the most isolated parts of the Amazon. When he was a young man into the 1960s, he was making a living hunting and fishing with bows and arrows and clubs, clearing gardens like the one he's standing in with stone axes, and then the government ran a road through the center of his territory. Within less than 5 years, at least 2/3 of the previous population had died of introduced diseases, and then a small handful of survivors was transferred to an existing reserve a couple hundred kilometers away in what was, from Crentoma and his people's perspective, essentially another planet, socially, culturally, economically, and ecologically. I got to meet Crentoma in the early 1980s when he and his people were in a process of reconstructing their society and culture in these radically changed circumstances. When I went and lived in his village to do thesis research for a degree in anthropology for a year and a half. I learned his language and had the privilege of witnessing this process of reconstruction. Well, some years after that, he called on me and some Brazilian colleagues, then in a Brazilian NGO, to help him with some ideas that he and his people had come up with. He basically had figured out that in the white people's world you can own land, and the government owed them something for everything that they had lost in the contact, including their territory. And he asked us would we help him go back and see what had happened to his traditional territory, which he and the Panara had wanted to do for 15 years that they'd been in the Xingu Park, this new reserve, and had not been able to. Well, we did that. We helped them go back. We discovered that the core of their traditional territory was almost completely destroyed from their perspective. It's overrun virtually from the moment that they were relocated. But that there was an existing area close to us, 500,000 hectares of intact forest where virtually nothing was going on. And they asked us would we help them go back and recover that. They recognized, okay, this is our land. Where we're living in other people's land is not working well for us. Our population is growing. We want to get back our traditional territory. So we looked around and we figured out that in fact nothing was going on in this considerable territory except there was one small airstrip, a group of ranchers from another part of the state of Mato Grosso was beginning to subdivide the land to sell it off, completely illegally. It was public land, but also at the time the most common form of land occupation in new frontiers in the Amazon. But we said, yeah, we'll help you, but we have to be quick and discreet. So we put together a project to allow them to go back, occupy their traditional territory, so we could then bring the National Indian Foundation, the Indigenous agency, to begin the process of official recognition of their territory. Well, long story short, it took a number of years, but Krentoma and the Panara are back in their traditional territory. They are doing a very good job of controlling access to it. There were a bunch of people who thought they were going to start cattle ranches there that the Panara have put out or have mobilized the governments to do that, and they're doing very well. Their population a few years ago reached and in fact surpassed the pre-1968 population for the first time. Very young, growing, doing extremely well. Well, so there's a couple points about this story that are really relevant to how we got to the situation of having half of the Amazon protected. Basically, this story is a microcosm of the story of indigenous peoples of the Amazon in the second half of the 20th century. And to multiply Krentoma's story by a couple hundred times, and you can see how we got from having, when his story started into the 1960s, to having a kind of generic constitutional right for indigenous peoples and virtually nothing on the ground to, today having close to 25% in indigenous territories, and then another behind that, particularly in the frontier areas, some 25% in protected areas, most of which is much more like indigenous territory than it is like parts of the United States. In other words, it is all inhabited. A large part of that is, in fact, also was modeled on indigenous territories. So a large part of the sustainable use areas in Brazil in particular. But beyond indigenous territories, when we talk about protected areas, we're talking about lands that have small, isolated, traditional populations in them as well. Now, this situation is not. Other key point: indigenous territories and protected areas are doing an excellent job of stopping frontier expansion. A key part of the reason why Brazil has been able so far to reduce its deforestation over 70%, 75% since 2005 has been the creation and protection of indigenous lands and protected areas. You can see here the Kayapo territory, the green in the middle of the image, surrounded by fires in the burning season. And this pattern holds in general. So they are critical to controlling deforestation. Furthermore, this correspondence between high carbon forests, high biodiversity, and huge cultural linguistic diversity, the presence of indigenous peoples, is something that holds not only in Brazil and the Amazon, but around the world. If we look if we look at where in the world we have over 90% forest canopy cover, which is basically in the tropics, and then compare that to the distribution of the languages of the world, which are actually in Brazil and the Amazon are underestimated on this map for reasons that I could go into later. We can see that really there's a pretty close correspondence. So indigenous peoples and high carbon, high biodiversity forests are linked, geographically distributed in the same places around the world. So, tropical forest conservation, indigenous rights, part of the same story everywhere. Now, the other thing, just to conclude here, kind of two final points. This has been a long political process in all of these different countries, but there's a very important cultural dimension at issue here as well. When Kantoma's story started at the end of the 1960s, most of the people who knew the most about what was happening with indigenous peoples in the Amazon, and who were indeed most concerned with the future of indigenous peoples at the time, thought that what was in process was an ineluctable, irreversible kind of process of decay and loss. People who looked like young Bemp Kayapo on the right here would inevitably be transformed into kind of generic Indians like Zebade and his family on the left here, and eventually, if not, if they wouldn't, in fact, all die out or be exterminated, they would lose their specific cultural identities, their language, their culture, and become kind of a rural proletariat. This was even anthropologist Darcy Ribeiro, one of the people most responsible for making indigenous rights a national issue in Brazil in the 1950s and 60s, really thought that this was just an inevitable process, that the forces of development and the international economy were too strong for these small, isolated cultures to resist. Well, in point of fact, what's happened has been the exact opposite. There's been a proliferation of indigenous peoples, cultures, and a reassertion of ethnic and cultural identities all over the Amazon, such that that the map that we see, the map that Tina and Wayne were showing you of the indigenous territories and those carbon stocks, really is a reflection of the resilience and the vitality of the indigenous cultures and this process of reaffirmation and strengthening of indigenous identities across the basin. But, final point, at the same time, this is a very fraught and fragile process. As deforestation has gone down in Brazil, as more indigenous territories and peoples have been recognized, there's been huge political pushback. Their basic constitutional rights are now at issue in the Brazilian Congress. There are serious attacks being mounted by agricultural interests in the Congress. At the same time, in many parts of the Amazon, fundamental human rights are still a real issue. Only a few months before the UN Climate Conference in Lima, indigenous leader in Peru, Edwin Chota, so it's been for years trying to mobilize the government to stop illegal logging in the Ashaninka territories. It was murdered apparently by illegal loggers along with 3 colleagues on their way to an indigenous conference on illegal logging. This is not an isolated incident. So great gains on a kind of macro level, at the same time that fundamental rights are still an issue and still need to be put in focus and still need to be seriously addressed across the basin. So I'll stop there and open it up for questions. Thanks.
This is Chris Meyer again from Environmental Defense Fund, the moderator, and I'd like to thank Steve, Tina, and Wayne for their presentations. They're all excellent. And I hope that some of you have seen that we're now opening for questions, and I see a couple questions, but I hope that there might be more questions, and I do request to all of you that have been participating or listening in to write your questions now, so I can address those and get those answered, if you might have some. I do want to, before we start going into the questions, to recognize that we had some financial support from some different donors here. Most importantly, it was actually the World Bank, the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. They have what they call a capacity building program fund that was a source of financing for this collaboration, in addition to some funds from USAID and the Ford Foundation that were leveraged to help make this happen. So with that, I would like now to ask a question I have here from Goril Andresen, and my apologies if I just mispronounced your name, and I'm going to ask this question to Wayne, and the question is, what is the method behind analyzing the above-ground carbon density?
Great question. So the method that was used is perhaps best detailed in the publication that was mentioned during my presentation, which is by Baccini et al., 2012, and that was published in Nature Climate Change. So you can find a great deal of methodological detail about how we put together that map of carbon stock in that publication. But just to provide a brief overview, we combined remote sensing information, satellite data, optical data on the one hand from the MODIS, the NASA MODIS satellite, as well as some spaceborne LiDAR data, together with field data from across the tropics. We put those data sets together and through some fancy algorithms generated this map of pan-tropical above-ground carbon stocks at 500 meters. But the details, the nitty-gritty, can be found in Baccini et al. 2012, Nature Climate Change.
Thank you, Wayne, for answering that quite great question. And the next question I have coming from Marc Antoine Dupois, and again, apologies maybe for massacring your name there. And the question I will again send to you, Wayne, is the part on the ground and below the ground relevant to carbon storage density?
Well, both are certainly important, and in the context of this analysis and in the context of the mapping project that we conducted, we focused only on the above ground portion. So this analysis did not include the below ground portion. But I would say where the indigenous territories and the protected natural areas are concerned, the above ground portion is that portion that, for the most part, is subject to the greatest risk, the highest pressures, the highest threats, at least outside of, say, the peatlands in Indonesia, which of course are also threatened. But apart from those specific cases in Indonesia of peatlands, the below ground portion tends to be relatively stable over time, whereas it's the above ground portion that of course is of much greater concern, where deforestation and so forth is concerned.
Thank you, Wayne. What I do want to note is Tina's been very generous also, and if you're following the chat box, you can see some links that she's added to answer some of those questions too. And so you please click through. In addition, I previously added a link to the carbon map product, and I'll do it again right now. And that is, again, one of the products that Tina mentioned. And there's a link there. If you want to look into it in more detail and download it, you can do that through that link and from that website. So I think the next question is coming from Nina, and I'm going to target this to Steve first, and maybe Tina, you can add on some insight to this too, around elaborating on the differences in the recognition of indigenous land rights among the 9 different countries, and then any particular best practices or highlights or challenges that need to be overcome.
Okay, well, there are basically 9 different legal regimes for recognition of indigenous land rights in the nine countries. I don't know, one place that I could refer you, a study that we commissioned a few years ago, done by a Colombian indigenous rights lawyer, Viviani Rojas, looks at legal frameworks for indigenous land rights across the basin, asking the question of whether or not indigenous communities can benefit from incentive projects for deforestation reduction, for reducing emissions from deforestation. And it comes to the conclusion that in most of the Amazon countries, indigenous people's land rights and resource rights, which are the 2 key conditions, at a high level are in place. But there's a great deal of variation from place to place. I mean, Tina perhaps could talk some about the situation in Venezuela, where there are kind of constitutional rights, but on the ground it works out much differently. I guess it's, in general, I would say that the key challenges are less the kind of high-level legal frameworks, which are, with maybe the exception of Guyana, Suriname, French Guyana, which is another story, are in general fairly good, and the real implementation of those on the ground, and then just the fundamental rights situation. If somebody is protesting illegal logging and denouncing illegal logging to the government in Peru for years, is murdered because of that, there clearly is a right issue and an issue of implementation of rights, which I think is something that is not only an issue in Peru but elsewhere.
Yeah.
Too.
Well, in some countries, for example, you can find very huge areas under indigenous territories, and some countries, like in Peru, also the territories that are recognized in some cases are too small. I refer more like the areas that the indigenous people use directly. So in countries like Venezuela, just before the Rio Cumbre, la reunión de Rio de 1992, we don't have any indigenous territory recognized. So the government tried to declare a lot of natural protected areas like a substitute. That is the reason that why in Venezuela, how Wayne showed, we have a lot of overlapping between natural protected areas and traditional indigenous territories. But however, in the case of Venezuela, the indigenous peoples are trying to have the big area, the whole territory, under recognition. I think this is a very important difference between some countries, because it's very different that if you have all the management of their own territory, or if you have only the small area where you are using directly for activities like agriculture or timber or logging, I mean. So I think this is, we need to study more about what is the meaning of pressures and threats in that areas, with the difference, with the different strategies that the indigenous peoples are using, or the governments are permitting they use. I think we need to explore more the meaning of the threats and pressures for carbon storage in that areas.
Thank you, Tina and Steve. And Tina, I have another question coming your way, and it's specifically more around those kind of pressures and threats, and specific to Peru, and the threats of illegal logging to indigenous territories. And I might just ask you to elaborate a little bit more too, not only to Peru, but your overall analysis, is illegal logging a threat to other indigenous territories outside of Peru also, if you have that information? Thank you.
Yes, but well, in our analysis, we are not including the logging, illegal or legal, whatever, because we are only analyzing deforestation. And we are using the deforestation like a resume of agricultural pressure, grazing pressure, and logging pressure. So we know that in some countries like Peru, the pressure is not pressure, it's the threat. And well, in some countries like Peru, the pressure is higher. In other countries like Venezuela, the threat is higher because we have a lot of forest reserve, and that area is supposed to be for extraction of timber. And I think this is the same that in Brazil, right, Steve? You have a lot in Brazil. You have a lot of area forest reserve where it's legal the extraction.
Yes, and there's now a whole system of concessions as well, although it's been, as far as I understand, quite slow to really be structured and to start up. But I think illegal logging is an issue in
Yes.
a lot of places. I mean, we've in the Xingu Basin, in this entire complex of indigenous territories and protected areas, it's about 28 million hectares. We've seen something that I think for the frontier regions holds pretty generally, which is that legal recognition of these territories, whether indigenous lands or areas, is quite effective at stopping deforestation. Deforestation per se, in terms of clear cutting or to establish cattle pasture or agriculture, but less effective in terms of stopping degradation, particularly for selective logging. Selective loggers don't need to occupy the land; they just need to get in and take out the hardwoods. Clearly, in Peru, with the human rights violations there, this continues to be a big issue, and I think this kind of goes to the heart of the fragility of enforcement efforts. Brazil, in particular, has put a lot into enforcement efforts, but for a series of reasons, this kind of inefficiency in collecting fines and endless amounts of legal recourse for the perpetrators of these things, it's been very difficult to make these things effective. And I think this, in general, that is one of the kind of most serious threats that needs to be addressed.
Okay, Tina, I want to. There's one more question I want to get to, and I want to follow up with that a little bit. And if you can maybe provide a little bit of a brief answer on why it's difficult to include illegal logging in the pressures and threat methodology.
Well, because we are using remote sensors in order to identify the deforestation, in order to follow the deforestation, and in some countries the illegal logging is in a very small scale. So until this moment, we can not able to distinguish very well. In some, I mean, for example, in the case of Colombia and Venezuela, it's not easy to distinguish between them. It's the same like the illegal mining in the small scale. Okay, in that case, we can follow degradation, but we cannot distinguish the activity at this moment. How I said before, we are starting, and I think Steve said the same. We are starting in this process of a collaboration with the team, the Wayne team, and I think we have a lot of work to do.
Thank you, Tina. And I think this last question is probably best answered by you too, and this will be the last question of the webinar. So if it cuts off all of a sudden, please note we want to thank the webinar team from the bank for facilitating this. They did a great job helping us. It's been a bit of a challenging technology with the weather situation here in D.C., and we're connecting from around the world, you might say, with Tina also. But we hope to do this again, and as like Tina said, continue this work to maybe hopefully tackle those questions, like you said, and get more answers around specifically illegal deforestation. Tina, the last question here is from Adriana Morea. Again, apologies on the name. And that it was around more about the potential for creating mosaics of protected areas, indigenous territories. What's the thinking about this in different countries, and is there low-hanging fruit?
Sorry, I missed you. I missed part of the question. Sorry.
I'll repeat again. Adriana Moreira was interested in hearing more about the potential for creating and managing mosaics of protected areas in indigenous territories across the basin. Mosaic being overlapping and or collaboration or connections there. Is that possible? And do you have some specific areas where you think that it's most likely to happen easier?
The overlap between the protected areas and indigenous territories?
Or connecting indigenous territories and protected areas, let's say, and maybe even between countries.
Yes, I think so. And at this moment, some people in Brazil, Colombia, and Venezuela are discussing about one area that connecting the north of the Amazon, and they are taking into account protected areas, indigenous territories, and so on. Because sometimes protected areas and indigenous territories is totally connected, interconnected. Sometimes in some countries, indigenous territories are considered like almost like protected areas. It's not the case of Colombia or Venezuela or Ecuador. It's very different. But in some countries like Brazil, it's quite similar. So yes, I think if you can organize a very good connection between both, maybe the governance of the area will be better, okay? Because at this moment, it's not only about okay, how many carbon do you have in protected areas or indigenous territories? It's more like how is the governance in the Amazon area region, okay? So we need to go in that direction, connecting both areas and also understanding the difference between the protected areas, because a lot of them have direct use, and that means that themselves could be threatened for the carbon storage, for example.
Right. So yeah, there's
just to add really briefly to that, I think those are terrific points. It's a really good question, Adriana. As you know, we've been working for some time in the Xingu, in this complex of indigenous territories and various categories of protected areas. It's a huge opportunity, but also a huge challenge. I think in general, it's fair to say that there are no existing institutional mechanisms for the governance of these kind of continuous corridors of different kinds of protected areas plus indigenous territories. And I think as Tina is suggesting, these governance mechanisms needs to be developed from the bottom up. We need kind of a discussion between the indigenous and other populations in these territories and interested stakeholders to really build effective governance mechanisms, because just the value of these enormous continuous areas is really huge. It's definitely greater than there are wholes that are greater than the sum of their parts.
Okay, well, I want to thank again all our presenters again, Steve, Wayne, and Tina. Remind everybody that you can find the different products. There was a link to the specific map. In addition to, you can find our journal online, the article that was published and peer-reviewed. We hope to continue this collaboration and produce more work like this and presentations. And We hope that that we presented today through the different products and sharing those with your colleagues, in addition to, of course, if you found this webinar presentation very interesting, to sharing it with your colleagues also. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.